Welcome back. And in this is our fourth part of the lecture on contemporary art. And I think before we kind of finish just kind of reviewing the artists that we're looking at in this lecture, and remember, primarily what we're doing is we're just kind of doing a very quick survey of a lot of different contemporary artists to give you just an overview or overall feel for contemporary art. But I thought like I should at least give you some kind of conceptual point to hold together a lot of what we're seeing here. So I'm going to go back just a little bit, and we're going to go to this point here for a second. I want you to think about all the things we have learned about this particular piece, about Felix Gonzalez-Torres, when this piece was introduced in the class in the first place, which was in the memorial impulse, and I used it as an example of like a most contemporary type of version of memorial, an impermanent memorial, a participatory memorial. Okay, so now let's look at Rachel Whiteread for a second. And if you remember in this course, I think the first time I brought up Rachel Whiteread was where I talked about her in relation to sculpture as a contemporary sculptor, and a sculptor who took whose whole point of view was to take one of the fundamental aspects of sculpture, the sculpture's interest in the relationship between positive and negative volumes in space, and kind of flip that on its head by making these sculptures be entirely positive manifestations of purely negative volume space. So like taking the negative volume spaces of places and then making casts of those. And so, oops, lost my mic there. So the thing I want you, I guess the main point I want to put into this last lecture about contemporary art is a lot of contemporary art, a lot of postmodern art, and art that might be described as postmodern. One of the fundamental values of this art, especially how it's different from art of modernism and romanticism, is the value of dialogue. That in postmodern and in contemporary art, dialogue is a very important part of the nature of artwork. Both dialogue in terms of how the artist makes a work of art or makes a whole body of art, a series of works of art, in dialogue with previous artists, in dialogue with art history, in dialogue with critics and writers of art, but also that every time a person sees a work of art, right, there's a dialogue between the audience, the viewer, the artwork, and to a certain degree with the artist. Although, you know, when you're there looking at the work, you have to almost like imagine the artist because you don't know, the person isn't standing there next to you. But you might have a label that tells you a little bit about the artist and about their intentions. So it's this dialogue, and I think that interesting contemporary art that is that feels very contemporary to me, and also feels very interesting, tends to be the kind of art that inspires these very open-ended and very multi-layered and complex type dialogues with the work, where participating with the work, maybe getting involved with the work, is a form of dialogue itself, and where part of that is also getting the person observing the work to think about how this piece is in part of a dialogue within the larger scope of that artist body of work. That one piece is part of a dialogue with the whole body of work made by that artist, and also that whole body of work and every piece that artist made is part of a dialogue with contemporary art, with all other art makers of their generation, but with also the history of art. So I think if you get nothing else about contemporary art, that's kind of an important value, and then a point that explains a lot of art. I mean, one of the things to remember is that Romanticism and modernism and postmodernism all share one thing in common, which is that they all are very focused on art as the point of art, right? They have different things they want to do with art, different objectives with art, but they don't see, like in previous times, especially before the Baroque, or even at the beginning of the Baroque, right? It wasn't until the Rococo and the neoclassicism that we have the beginnings of this idea of art being there for a purpose of saying something about art. Before that, even if we go back to the Carracci-Caravaggio divide, art is about how it serves the needs of power, of religion, of wealth, of commerce, right? And how it serves its clients. And whereas from Romanticism on, the idea that art, to a certain degree, serves art, that an artist might not have goals about, communicating religion or power, or wanting necessarily to make a living, um, and that still want to make art and have something they want to say with their art, becomes a more and more, I wouldn't say convincing, but it definitely becomes a more prevalent concept in art making. And I think that that's something that, to a degree, modernism and postmodernism shares with Romanticism. This notion that art is, it's about a lot of different things, but that in a fundamental kind of way, art is about art. And I think from the postmodern point of view, art is about this ongoing and very complex conversation about art. If modernism was much more about art kind of teaching you, revealing kind of essential truths about art, about painting, right? That, like when you look at a Mondrian, it's telling you paint is just, a painting is just paint on a surface. Whereas a postmodern work of art is much more about a dialogue, right? That these paintings raise that question, but they also raise the possibility that art is just simply an individual person exploring their quirky individual imagery, or that art is just a joke, right? And you have to decide whether you believe what it is that the artist's intentions were and what you believe is the important things in art, why you might be attracted to this particular work or not. I like Nara myself, but you may not. Um, some find those big-eyed girls a little bit disturbing. Um, and at each of the artists that I've been talking about in this last lecture are artists who make work that is part of a dialogue, that in the act of making it, they're making a statement that's part of a conversation. Probably no one more so than Damien Hirst. But you can say the same about Gary Hume. You can definitely say the same about Matthew Barney. Remember that we started this whole process a unit ago talking about Matthew Barney and his relationship to Bruce Nauman in the drawing Restraint. And I think you can also make a strong case of Matthew Barney being heavily influenced by people like shoot, I'm blanking on it for a second. But even I'll get back to that in a second. Let me say about Shio Kusaka that even pieces like this, which may seem to an outsider to the art world as basically just being artwork, just pieces of ceramics, within the context of the art world, they are very much a part of a dialogue. I mean, one of the main things she's saying about art is that art doesn't have to be so formal, so serious, so concept-minded. Art can be casually humorous and lighthearted and still be gorgeous and still be important and worthwhile. I love Sheila Hicks' work. And once again, and another thing I would say about this whole issue of dialogue is that sometimes it's other people making the dialogue. I think in the case of Sheila Hicks, it's as much about all of her defenders, the young artists who are great admirers. All right, I'm running out of time. So who else do we need to look at? Richard Prince, Cindy Sherman, Toma Apps. Oh, wow. I have a lot of artists. Thomas Demand. All these photographs are made photographs of tiny setups that he makes entirely out of paper. And Glenn Brown. And so lastly, I just want you to think about these three works of art that we finished off, the Intimist lecture and finished off the Ideological Impulse lecture, to rethink of them now based on this context of all this contemporary art that we just saw and see how like we've been experiencing this from the beginning. All right, that is the very end.